Welcome to this module. So we added the form in the last lecture. Now it's time to dive deeper into text and fonts. We already use a custom font, we could say, from Google Fonts. That's the font we imported earlier in this course. But I think we should dive deeper right here and see what we can do with text and fonts in CSS. So what will we cover in this module? Well, we will start and have a look at the difference between a generic and a font family. After we understood that, we will see how we can use and import font families. We saw that we did that with Google Fonts already. We will also dive deeper into that. But we'll also see that we have other options to, use and import font families in CSS, and by that on our website. In addition to that, we'll have a look at a lot of different font properties. So we will see which properties we have, what impact they have, and how we can use them. Finally, we'll also have a look at the font shorthand, which kind of lets us combine multiple properties in one single property. So that's what's inside this module. Let's start now with a theoretical look at generic and font families. So we have generic families and we have font families. What's the difference? Well, a generic family is something like this: serif or sans serif. Well, as you can imagine, the difference is that serif has a font style, which is including serifs, and sans serif, doesn't have serifs. But we have more of these generic families. We also have cursive. Well, I think the name tells you already what that could stand for or why it's called cursive. We also have monospace and we have fantasy. I made fantasy a bit gray because it's not the most usual generic family you could use. We'll still have a look at it though. But the thing is that these generic families are kind of a headline, which therefore define a specific attribute of the fonts that are inside this generic family. For example, the cursive generic family includes fonts which are, cursive. And by saying includes, this brings us to the font families, because that's actually more specific, and these are actually the different fonts we have inside our generic family. For serif, for example, this could be Times New Roman or Georgia. So both are part of this generic family, the serif family, and as you can see in the different font families, Times New Roman and Georgia, both have these serifs in them, but they look different though. We also have other font families which are part of the sans serif generic family. This could be Helvetica or Radana. These are of course all just examples. We have a lot more font families for all our generic families. The thing is that for these fonts, both don't have any serifs, again, as the generic family indicates, and that's this general attribute or characteristic these font families, which are part of a specific generic family, are sharing. For cursive, as we can imagine, we have this cursive style. Well, probably not the most beautiful one, but still, this is for example Brush Script and Mistral. And we have monospace, so we have Courier New or Lucida Bright. And for fantasy, I didn't add any font families. As I said, it's a pretty uncommon generic family, as I would say. Nevertheless, we'll also cover that throughout this module. So that's the general theoretical background that we need. We have generic families, which kind of define a specific core attribute. And inside these generic families, we have multiple font families, which share this common attribute, of course, but nevertheless look different. So that's the first theoretical introduction. Let's now go to our browser and see if we can find such generic families and font families in there. So back in our project, and I'm on the packages page because we will stay right here to play around with the fonts throughout this module. And as I said, I would like to show you that you can find, or where you can find, the generic families and the font families in your browser. We are using Chrome in this course, so that's what it looks like in our case. In case you're using a different browser, the menu and the style selected might look different, but the general idea is the same. Because if we simply go to our preferences right here and then go down to this Customize Fonts menu right here, this one. And then scroll down a bit right here. Then we can see some interesting things actually, because we can see that we have a standard font, which is the font that will be applied, well, as a standard by the browser. And inside this font, we can select different font families. That's interesting, right? These are not generic families, these are already font families. Okay, so that's what we can see. That's the standard behavior. We will see how we can change that, how we can impact that. We'll have a look at that throughout the module. Alternatively, we can also see that we have a serif font right here. This is a generic family now. For this generic family, we can now also select a font family. Important, this list right here also includes font families which are not part of the sans serif generic family. For example, Verdana, we saw that this is actually a sans serif font. However, you can select the font you want to have for your serif font family right here. We got the same thing for sans serif right here, and we got the fixed width font generic family, which is basically the monospace family we saw on the slide. However, this is what we can see in the browser, so we have these different fonts available right here. But the actual question is now, what will actually be displayed? Which font will be used by the browser? Because we can see that we can select generic families right here. We can also select font families. We have the standard font. So what's the font that will be displayed in the end? Let's have a look at that, because we have multiple options to have an impact on that. Because the starting point is, of course, this one. We are basically browsing onto our website and want to display it. Now, the default behavior, the one right here, is basically defined by the browser. That's what we saw. This is this standard font. And what do I mean by default behavior? Well, the default behavior simply means that we didn't specify any kind of font family in our CSS code, because with that, the browser will simply choose the standard font that we applied and use the font family that is selected in the browser. That's the default behavior that we have. Now, one alternative we have is this one. We can define a generic family in our CSS code right here. With that, we could use one of the other options we saw, because we had this standard font. This was option 1. But then we could also see that we could choose different font families for the different generic families in the browser settings. And with that, we could tell the browser, please choose a specific generic family, sans serif for example, and then select the font family that was chosen in the browser settings. That's the second option we have. The third option would be that we specify a font family. In contrast to that, this will not be influenced directly by the browser settings, because in the browser settings we have different font families available, but we could also select a font family in our CSS code which is not available by default in the browsers of our users. Because of that, we have 3 different options again where to retrieve these font families from. The first option would be this one. The font family we specify in the CSS code is saved locally on the user's computer. Now, as you can already imagine, this can lead to a lot of problems because the user's computer is a local computer, and therefore we cannot control which font families are installed, which ones are not. So the chances are quite high that our website, at least the fonts on our website, will look different for a lot of users. We'll have a look at that though and see how we can implement some fallbacks to ensure that we can at least specify a generic family to make sure that the page looks at least kind of what it was intended to. So that's the first option, not the best one probably. Then we have the second option. We can use web fonts, and this is what we actually do in our project here. Because as we saw, we import our fonts that we use on the website from Google Fonts with a so-called web font. So basically, we retrieve the font from a third party. We did that already. Nevertheless, we'll also have a closer look at it in this module. And then we have a third option. The third option simply means that we retrieve the font that we want to apply, the font family, from a server. And this could be, for example, our own server, so the server where our website is hosted. Therefore, we again have the control of the font families and make sure that the user can display these families, nevertheless, if these are available in the browser or if these are saved to the computer. And with that, we can ensure that the website looks as intended for most of our users. So these are the options we have, how we can specify what should be displayed or which font family, which font style should be applied to our website. So the best thing we can do right now probably is to jump back to our code and have a look at all these things in practice. So let's do that in the next lecture. So we understood that we have different ways to add different font families or generic families to our website. Now let's have a look at the current situation on our website now and then play around with this font family property. For that, I'm on the packages page and I would like to have a look at a specific part of this page, at this part right here, our package info class. Why do I want to choose that? Well, because inside this package info class, we basically have just some text, and I think text is something we need if we want to play around with font families. Now, as you can see, I selected this class right here. And if I now pull this up a bit, we can see that we have a specific font size applied. We know the font size property already. Nevertheless, we'll also have a look at that again. But the important thing we have to keep in mind now is that the font family, this one right here, is now inherited from our body. Because at the beginning of this course, we imported the font family from Google Fonts. So basically, we use a so-called web font right now. We will also keep this web font for the entire website, but I would like to change this default font family right here for our package info class. Therefore, let's have a look at the import of the web font again to see what we did so far. And let's then change the font family for our info class, for our package info class right here. In our project, if we go to the index.html file, so the main index.html file, you can see that these are the links to the Google web fonts that Max added throughout this course. We will keep these links. I will not delete them because we will still use these web fonts. But the important thing is that this is the import we have to make sure that the fonts are available to all our users. In the shared CSS file then, right here, we can see that we have our body selector and we said that the font family should be Montserrat or sans serif. I'll dive into the syntax in a few seconds. So this is Montserrat right here. And if we go back to our index.html file, we can see that this was imported right here. Now with that, we made sure that our entire website basically uses this font family. And if you now think back about our slides, I said that the first way to display fonts is the default way. So basically, let the browser decide what font family it should display. Now what happens if I comment this font family out right here, like this and like that, and now go back to our website. Keep in mind, at the moment we use the Montserrat font family right here. And if we now reload the page, we can see some interesting things. The first thing we see is that our nav bar kind of crashed. What's the reason for that? Well, the font family that now is applied by default, we will in a few seconds find out which one this is, simply needs more space, more width than the family we had before, our web font. This means if we go back to the shared CSS file and scroll down to our, well, as I would call it, dirty fix, this one right here, and increase the width right here in our calculation to 70, for example, and would reload the page, you can see that the nav bar would work again. Still, this is our dirty fix for the moment, so we will keep it to 44 for now, because the nav bar is not our actual focus. I just wanted to show you that we could fix that easily, but it's not the purpose of this module now. As we are talking about the nav bar already, and you probably fixed this in the meanwhile, but if we go to the customers page and then click on to start hosting, then you had this error before. As I said, you probably fixed it already. In case you didn't, just go to the index.html file in the customers folder. And if you now scroll down a bit, you can see the reason for this error right here. we have to move one level up right here. So for the third list item right here. So you have to add dot dot and a slash. And if we now go back to our page, jump back, and now click Start Hosting, you can see that this link is working fine now. Now back to packages. I just wanted to make sure that we have the same status in our project now. And we can also close this index.html file and scroll up again to our body selector in the shared CSS file. Ooh, that was a lot of jumping around now. I hope you are still with me, because now we can go back to our actual problem. And the actual problem is not a real problem, because we actually simply commented out the font family, this one right here. So at the moment, we don't have any font family applied in our code. And still we saw that the font changed. Let me maybe comment this out quickly for you so that we can see what happened. Let's do this one like that. Here we had our font that we imported. And if we now comment this out again, we are back with the new font. As you can see, the font family changed, obviously. If we look into our styles, we cannot find the font family anymore. Right here, there is no font family. But if we go to our computer tab and then scroll down a bit, right here to our font family, this one, you can see that Verdana is now applied. And if you remember when we had a look at the browser settings, Verdana was somewhere there. Let's have a look and go back to the settings right here. And indeed, our standard font is now Verdana. This means if I change this to Times New Roman, for example, and go back to our website, you can see that the font family now changed to Times New Roman. But I think this is really ugly, so let's switch it back to Verdana maybe. Like that. So as you can see, if we don't add the font family property to our code on the website, then the default browser setting is the one that defines the font family that you selected there. And the disadvantage of this approach is, of course, that, as I said in the beginning on the slide, the font family then totally depends on the user settings, and with that, you have no control at all of the font family that will be displayed on your website. So not adding a font family, probably not what we are going to do. So let's go back to the code and let's see what else we can change right here. Because if we comment that in again, and with that have our good looking layout once again, we can see that this declaration right here, the values follow a certain pattern, obviously. Because the first value right here, this one, is the font family that we want to address. Please note the capital letter right here and the quotation marks. The quotation marks are actually not necessary all the time right here. You have to add them though if your font family consists of multiple separate names and so therefore you have white spaces, then it's required. Right here we could also delete those like that. And if we now reload the page, we can see that it would still work. Nevertheless, you can add them all the time. It's not a problem actually. And after this font family, we have this sans serif right here. And as we learned, sans serif is a generic family. And this already shows you the general pattern how you should write this declaration. You first start with the most specific thing you have. And the most specific thing you have is basically your font family. This could, by the way, not only be one family, this could also be two or more families. For example, we could use Verdana right here. Let's also add the quotation marks like that, and then add sans serif at the end. What will simply happen then is your browser will look for Montserrat. In case he can find it, he will apply the Montserrat font family. If he can't find it, he will jump to the next font family, Verdana. If he cannot find this one, he will jump to the next one, and so on, and so on. And in the end, he will simply fall back to this, well, fallback, the generic family, and then simply apply a font family out of the generic family you defined. Now, what I simply mean by that is, if we would fall back to sans serif, the browser would select Helvetica in our case, because we specified in the browser settings that if the generic family that should be displayed based on the code is sans serif, then use the Helvetica font family, please. Let's maybe try that out quickly. And enter a value as like unknown right here. So the unknown font, I don't think this one is existing. So if we now try this out and maybe not use Verdana as our second font family, because this is our standard font right here. So let's maybe use another font. Let's see which one looks different. This one right here, I don't know. Yeah, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘, this one right here. This is a font family we would recognize. So let's go back to our code and add this one right here. So 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 with O like that. And if I now go back to our website right here and reload it, then you can see that this relatively ugly 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 style was applied. Why is this happening now? Well, because the unknown font family, so our first family right here, could not be found, of course. Therefore, the browser goes to the next one, the font family 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘, which was available in case of the Chrome browser, so in my case, and therefore this font family will be applied. If we would change that name right here to maybe also unknown, like that, and then reload the page, we can see that the font style changed again, because now we fell back to our sans serif generic family right here, and the sans serif family that we have is this one, Helvetica. If I would change that now again to maybe 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘, the one we just had, then you would see that the website changed according to that, because the fallback simply says, please choose the sans serif generic family and then select the font family that we defined in the browser right here. This was Helvetica, I think, so let's add it back like that. If we go back, Helvetica is back here. And that's actually the core idea of the syntax of this font family property. You define the property, of course, then you define the first font family you would like to have, then the second one, as many as you prefer actually. But in the end, you specify a generic family, because with that, you always make sure that the text on the website can be displayed, and the text that should be displayed, well, should at least be part of a generic family of your choice. However, we will change back the font family to our default value, and this was Montserrat right here, this one, because with that, our website looks the way it did before again. And for the next lectures, we will not use the entire website to play around with the font families, but we will focus on the packages CSS file and the package info class. As I said before, this basically refers then to this part right here. And with that, we can see the differences to our default font that we applied and to the new font we want to apply in an easier way. So with that, if we think back about the slide, we understood this default behavior with the standard font that will be defined or selected by the browser if we don't add the font family property. We also had a look at the generic family that we defined, and with that we allowed the browser to select the font family that was selected in the browser. This was our fallback basically. And we had a first look at the definition of a font family in CSS. What we didn't have a look so far at until this point is the difference between having the font family saved on the user's computer as a web font or retrieved from a server. So in the next lecture, we'll have a look at these and dive into the different approaches, the advantages and disadvantages. And we will start in the next lecture with the fonts that are normally installed on every user's computer. We will see what every user's computer actually is, how we can use them, and what the limitations are that we have using this approach. So let's have a look at this first method now, at this first source for our font families, the font family which is saved locally on our user's computer. Because you might say that so far throughout this module, we didn't have a problem with the font families at all, because basically our browser supported all of the font families we used, besides the unknown ones which I used to show you the syntax in general. But the problem, or it's not a problem, but the thing we have at the moment is that in Chrome, right here, we have a lot of default font families which are supported. And that's awesome. But what's not so awesome is that we cannot control the browser our website visitors are using. Therefore, in case your website visitor doesn't use Chrome, with the approaches we used so far, except for the web font, of course. But with the general approach of simply adding a font family to our code, chances are that not all our users will be able to receive the font, and therefore the fallback will be applied. Because the problem is, if you Google for CSS font stack right here, and then click onto this link, then you can see that the so-called web-safe fonts only include a limited amount of font families, because these are the generic families right here and the corresponding font families that are installed locally on your machine. So just by using a Windows machine, chances are quite high that Arial Black is installed on your computer by default. The same thing is true if you're using a Mac. And if you go down right here, for example, to Serif, you can see that Bodoni, this one right here, is not installed at all on the Mac. Vice versa, we see for this Didot, I don't know how it's pronounced to be honest, that this font family is not installed at all on Windows machines, but on many Macs. And this is what you have to keep in mind. In the end, just by adding font family, so our code that we added right here in the shared file, so just by adding this font family property without adding a web font like we did it right here, so if we would delete that and just add the font family like that, the only two things we would rely on is that either our user has this font family installed on his machine, maybe by default or afterwards, or that our browser knows this font family. And the problem with these approaches is, of course, again, we cannot control neither of that two factors, because we cannot force our users to install a font family, and we cannot force our users to use a specific browser. So one option you always have, of course, if you want to make sure that you reach a large audience with your font family, is to go to cssfontstack.com and check for the font families available right here. Because with that, you can of course make sure that a lot of your users should have this font family installed on their machines and therefore should be able to see your website the way you intend it to look like. But of course, that's not the best approach, because we don't want to be limited by the default font families installed on a machine. Therefore, we used this web font right here, which we imported from Google Fonts. And although we did that already, I would like to take a closer look at that and show you what we did, how we can do it, and why using this is probably a better approach than just relying onto the fact that our users have installed our font family by default on their machines. So let's have a look at web fonts. As I said, we used these already right here on our website, but I think it makes sense to have a look at it step by step now. How can we first find such a web font? Well, one good source is Google Fonts. For that, you can simply Google Fonts right here. And if you then click onto the link, you can find a huge list of a lot of different font families available right here. The good thing is that you can also customize these, because as you can see, you have 854 font families in total, maybe a bit too much. So right here in the categories tab right here, we could, for example, say we only want to see maybe sans serif font families. And with that, we only got 239 left. Still a lot, but I think a bit of a smaller list. However, let's say we want to pick a specific font family and add it as a web font to our website. There we could, for example, use, maybe the first one, this Roboto right here. As you can see, you have the Roboto name right here. That's the font family. And then you can have a look at the font family, for example, what it looks like as a sentence, as a paragraph, or alphabetically, or just by numerals. Or you could also say custom right here and type some text like hello, this is nice. With that, you can get an impression of the way, this font family would look like. Here you can play around with the font size, but this is also a property you already know, so you can change the font size in CSS. This is what we know. But we have one really interesting option right here, and this is that one. Because as you can see, we are still in the Roboto font family, but there are lots of different, what are these? I will tell you in a few seconds, things to choose. And these things to choose right here are so-called font faces. That's really an important concept that we have to understand. Because we have our generic family. This is sans serif right here. Inside this generic family, we have our font family. In our example, Roboto. And this font family Roboto now has different font faces. This light 300 is the so-called font weight. We'll have a look at that in the next lecture. The italic part right here is the font style. Also something we'll dive deeper into in the next lecture. The important thing now is that we have to specify a font face that we want to use. For example, regular 400 right here. Another one, medium 500, as you can see, would be thicker or fatter. But we will stick to the regular 400 one. Now with that, if you choose your font family and your font face, you simply press the plus right here. And down here in this menu, you can now find the code you need to import your font family into our code. The first option we have is the standard import option, this one. With that, we would have to use this link right here and add it now into our code, right here into the main index.html file. And that would be wrong, because remember, we want to play around now on the packages side, so this side right here. Now, until now, we didn't have a problem because we added our 𝗧𝗏 link, so this one right here, into all our index.html files. So into this one at the customers page, as you can see, 𝗧𝗏 right here, and also into the packages page. Right here is 𝗧𝗏. That's why showing you all the things so far in the index.html and the shared CSS file was not a problem. But right now, things are changing. Because now I want to import a new font family. And the problem is, if I would do that right here in our main index.html file, well, this main index.html file, of course, is not related or connected to our packages index.html file. And therefore, this font would not be available right there. So what we would have to do right now is, we would have to go back to our Google Fonts page right here. Now take this link and copy it. And now add it, that's important, in the index.html file of our packages folder. So right here. With that, we imported our Roboto font family to our index.html file in the packages folder. And if we now go to our packages CSS file, we can simply go down here to our package info class right there. And now simply say we want to use the font family Roboto. As I told you before, we can write it with single quotation marks, or in that case with normal quotation marks. And let's add sans serif as our fallback. If we do that now and go back to our website and reload the page right here, you can now see that the font family changed. And the really cool thing now is that if we go to our settings right here again in Chrome and have a look at the font families available, you can see that Roboto right here is not available. And this shows us that we were now able to import a totally new font family from Google Fonts. And with the way we did it right here, this would also work for other users. It does not depend on the browser you're using or on the fonts you have installed on your machine. It simply depends on the availability of these fonts at Google Fonts. So this is one way how we can import web fonts to our website. But the problem with that way is, and that's what we just saw, we have to add it to each HTML file that we have, because otherwise the font is not available on the page we want to have it. And this can definitely cause errors, so there might be a better alternative how to add such web fonts. The good thing is, if we go back to Google Fonts right here, we can see that the alternative we have is the add import method right here. This allows us to import the font in the CSS file right here by using this command right here. So basically the add import function. Let's try that out. So let's copy that and go back to our code. And now I will add the code right here in our shared CSS file, because we know that each index.html file, as we can see it right here, refers to the shared CSS file. So this one, the one in the packages folder, and of course also the start hosting index.html file and our main index.html file. So if we add the web font import in our shared CSS file, this should work. And let's maybe add the import right here on top of our page, like that. So that's the import we made. Let's save this, and let's now delete that part right here we added, so this link in the HTML file right here. And if we did everything correctly, then, well, we shouldn't see a change. So let's reload. And as you can see, it's still working. And that's why I personally prefer this import method, because it helps us to avoid mistakes. And I think it's easier to understand because we can quickly see that we have our shared CSS file, and here we have all our web fonts that we use. Now, as we don't have one single web font, but multiple web fonts, we should also add these. For that, we will simply copy this add import statement once and twice and keep the distance. And now we only have to see which other web fonts we have so far, because right here we have the family Anton, this one. So let's copy it right here and replace Roboto with Anton, like that. And then let's also use Montserrat, including these numbers. These are the font weights. We'll dive deeper into these in the next lecture. And let's add these also right here as the third import that we make. Now, with that, we can get rid of the links we have right here. This one in the main index HTML file, then the link we have in the customers file, and in the packages file, and finally in the start hosting index HTML file, like that. Now we should save all that. So saving this one, and the last one, and also the shared CSS file. So a lot of saving. And if we did everything correctly, we should be able to reload the page. Yeah, this looks fine actually. Let's also have a look at the starting page. Yeah, I think this looks also good. And customers, yes, also still our font. And on the start hosting page, it still seems to work. So this is awesome, because with that we made our code a lot leaner, as I would say, and we can immediately see in our shared CSS file which web fonts we are using. And that's actually the core idea behind these web fonts. You simply choose the font of your choice right here on the Google font page, for example. Then simply use add import, that's at least my preferred method, to import the font to your code. And then you simply apply the font of your choice to the elements of your choice. That's the core concept. But there is one thing we didn't have a look at so far. And if I close that right here and go back to Roboto, then we had these options right here, these different font faces I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. And I think we should dive deeper into these in the next video. So what is this right here? What do we have there? Well, as I said before, this is basically the font weight. We also have the font style. I'll come back to that in a few seconds. But let's first focus onto the font weight. Now, what does this mean? If we go back to our code and to our package info right here, then we added the font family Roboto. And below that, we could now add a font weight, like that. And my IDE already shows you the options you have. You basically have numbers from 100 to 900, where a bigger number is equal to a bolder or fatter weight of the font. And then you have bolder, for example, which basically means that it is bolder than the inherited font. We already talked about inheritance throughout this course, therefore I will not dive deeper into that. What I will dive deeper into are these numbers, because basically the numbers, as I said, allow you to specify the weight of your font, and a number of 400 is the, well, equivalent, you could say, to a normal font weight. So you could also write normal right here, like that. This would be then a number of 400. And a number of 700 would be bold, so the one down here. Now, what happens if we add something like 900 here, for example? Well, let's see. If we go back to our page, right here, and reload it, you can see that nothing is happening. And this is actually strange, right? Because if we go back to Google Fonts right here, you can see that 900, this right here, is actually defined. The problem is that we only imported so far the regular font face, so this regular 400 font face. So what we did is basically we have Roboto 400 right here. That's our font family and the font weight. So that's basically what we can see right here, Roboto only. If we would like to use this 900 style I just showed you, so this one, then what we can do is we can click right here. Now hit the plus again, open this menu. Then you can see something interesting. Previously we only had Roboto here, right? You remember when we just imported the regular 400 font face. Now we added a second font face, this 900 font face right here. And so we can see that this was the regular style, the 400. And now we also have to add the 900 style. So what we can do now is we can simply copy both of these and add them right here. We need a colon first and then paste it like that. And with that, we now told our code that we want to import the Roboto font family with the 400 and 900 font face. That's important. The font faces, let me close that. These are the different font faces we have, and we have to import each font face separately to be able to retrieve the information for the corresponding font face on our website. What this simply means is that right now, if we go back to our packages file and we change it back to 900, the font weight right here, and now go back to the packages page and reload it, now the font weight increased. And that's the important concept you have to understand when working with fonts. Each or most of the font families have different font faces applied. And you have to import each of these font faces to your website. In the case of a web font, you can do this simply by adding it like this, as we saw it right here for Google Fonts. And with that, you are able to change the font weight. That's important. If you took a closer look, you also saw that the font weight was not the only parameter that impacts the font face. We also see italic right here. That's the font style. And if we select, for example, thin 100 italic right here and add this one, we can again see that this is also right here at import. Now add it right there, so 100i. So let's add that right here in front of the 400 right here at the Roboto font family. So 100i like that at a comma. And we could actually also get rid of that space right here like that. And save that, and now go to the packages file, and now important, change our font weight to our new 100 that we just imported, the 100i, and now add a font style of italic, this one right here. Now let's see if we minimize that and go back right here and reload the page. We can now see that we have this thin 100 italic style. Now an important information. If I would now go back to the shared CSS file and remove the I after italic, so just to make sure we have our thin 100 style right here. If I now would go back and reload the page, you can see the styling changes, but it only barely changes. The reason for that is that the browser is able to kind of add an italic style to our website, even though we didn't specify this individual font face. But as you could see, if I go back and add the I once again, right here, we can see it changes indeed the way the italic style is displayed. However, I don't think we need that I right here, so we can delete this I after the 100. We don't need the italic style. And I will also change this back to 900. I'll keep that italic style, so this default browser italic style though for the moment. We'll get rid of that soon in the next lectures. So if I now reload, this is the look we have at the moment on our website. And with that, you saw that it's really important to import the right font face that you want to have on your website, especially for the font weight, but also for the italic style, to make sure you really match the style that was intended from the beginning. And with that, we also saw, well, that we have these different font faces and how we can use them in connection with web fonts. But there is one additional way how to import fonts to our website. And this is creating our own fonts. Let's have a look at that in the next lecture. So the last option we have is adding our own fonts to our website. Well, this course is not about creating fonts, therefore I will use another approach to show you how this works. For that, I am back on Google Fonts, and let's now maybe select a monospace font, because we had sans serif a lot. So let's see, what could we use? I think this one, Anonymous Pro. This looks actually quite nice. If we look at this option right here, we talked about that, where we have the font weight and the font style right here defined. We can see that we have 4 different so-called font faces right here. So let's now select the regular 400, so the default font face right here, and again press onto the plus, as we did it before. Now right here, we can now get rid of the Roboto font, we don't need that, and we could of course import it again as we learned it. But this is our own font, right? Well, at least that's what we pretend now. So we want to find another way how to embed it onto our website. And for that, we can simply download this font by clicking right here. Once you finish the download and unzip the file, you can see these 4 TTF files right here. I'll talk about the file names and which files we have right here in the next lecture, so let's stick to this TTF for the moment. And as we can see, we have 4 different files. Each file represents a font face. So we have the bold font face, the bold italic font face, the regular italic font face, and the regular font face. So we want to add this regular font face to our page. So let's focus onto this one now. Now, to import this onto our website, we simply have to go to our CSS file. As I will only use it in our packages CSS file, I will add it right here on top of the page. So what we need to do is we need to write add font face like that. And of course add the curly braces. And now we need to specify a name for our font family. Well, the font family was anonymous, so let's maybe call it Anonymous Pro, like that. And we will again put it into quotation marks. You could also use single quotation marks if you want to, but I will stick to the normal quotation marks right here. So that's what we have. We now said that we have a font family that we want to import. That's basically what this code right here tells us. The problem is that we also need the files which contain the information, so we need to add a source right here, like that, and this should be a URL. The problem is that we don't have a URL at the moment because we didn't add the file we want to use to our code right here. So I will simply drag and drop this file right here into our packages folder because we only want to use it right there. So that's the Anonymous Pro regular TTF. That's the file I just dragged right there. So we now have the URL, which is simply, well, anonymous pro.ttf. That's our file name. So no, not pro, including regular. Sorry for that. We have to add this too. And that's it. With that, we imported our own font face, our custom font face. As you can see, not a lot different to the way we did it right here with our add import, but this time we simply added our file directly to our folder where our code is located. And with that, if we would assume that we have our code for the website hosted on our server, we would also host our code for the font families right there. And with that, we would again ensure that each visitor of our website can access this font. However, we have to add this font, of course, down here in our packages info class. And let's get rid of these properties for now. And let's change Roboto with anonymous pro now, like that. And if we now go back to our website, we can actually minimize that and right here, and we load the page. You can see that we now use our imported custom font that we used. And this is really cool actually. And now you could say, well, that's easy. Why don't we always do it like that? Well, the issue is the following. If we now have another look at the Google Fonts right here and think back about the different font faces, we have this regular one and this bold 700 one, for example. And let's say that we want to have this bold, this 700 font weight. Then we could add this, of course, right here, like that, font weight of 700. But the problem is if we now reload the page, like that, this bold style is not applied. Because again, keep that in mind, we only imported the regular font family. So this one right here, the regular TTF. And therefore our code and our browser have no idea what a bold Anonymous Pro font face would look like. So what we have to do right here is we have to import this specific font face. For that, we simply copy this first font face right here. And now important, don't change the font family because we of course want to refer to the same font family. We only want to be able to apply a bolder font weight to it. Therefore, we first have to add our bold file to our folder. So this one right here, like that. That's the Anonymous Pro bold. So we have to name it accordingly. Anonymous Pro bold, like that. And if we save that, and keep in mind, we still have the font weight of 700 right here, and reload the page, then you can see that the bold style was applied. The problem is that the code we wrote right now is not correct, because look back at our syntax. If we scroll up again right here, we can see that there is no difference in the font in general. The source is different, yes, but how should our browser or the code be able to differentiate between these two imports we have? So for example, if I now change the font weight to 400 here, which would be the normal font weight, and reload the page, nothing would change, even if I change it to normal, for example, like that. Because the problem is that based on the code we wrote right now, well, we will simply apply this last font face import. The first one won't be imported. Now we can simply change this, and by the way, I forgot the semicolons right here and right there. Please excuse that and make sure to add these. So we can change this by adding a font weight right here of 700, because that's the import that we did. That's the font weight that we have for our bold font style right here. With that, if we now scroll down again and keep this to normal and now reload, you can see that we now have the thinner font style. And if we change it back to 700, then if we did it correctly, we should have our bold font style back again. So that's the crucial thing right here. If you import multiple font faces up here, then make sure to add the font weight, which is the differentiation criteria between our different font faces. Otherwise, you will always use the last code. Another thing we could change right here, by the way, is the starting letter right here. This should actually be a small letter, not a capital letter. This is not crucial though, but this can cause problems with the Internet Explorer. So make sure to make these letters right here small ones, and then of course accordingly change this file right here and the second one also to these small letters like that. That's just a small cosmetical change, but we want to write our code as good as possible. Therefore, makes definitely sense to change that. With that, we saw how we can import our fonts with font face and how we can use our custom fonts with all the pros and cons that we have. But so far, we only used this TTF file format right here. Now, let's have a look at that in more detail and see if we have other file formats available for our font faces. So what about these font formats right here, this TTF that we used so far? By the way, we can also add the format after that, like this, with the quotation marks, and this would be the so-called true type format, like that. This is a optional information we can add. This simply gives the browser additional information regarding our font format right here. So as I said, not required, but to make sure our code is as complete as possible, we can actually add this right here and right there also. So for both of our imports right here for the font face. However, we only use this true type format so far. And the thing is that we have other file types available for our font formats. And now I could dive into all these formats step by step and talk about these. But I think the better approach is really if we just go back to 𝗓𝗢𝗢𝗏 and I show you some of the formats and especially the browser compatibility, because as we know so far, we want to make sure that as many visitors as possible can access the fonts on our website. So the browser compatibility is definitely an important factor. Now let's start with our TTF. This is the true type font or the open type font, also available right here. As we can see right here, the general support in the browsers is quite good. The only browser that's really not supporting it perfectly is Opera Mini, yeah, but also the IE, which only has a partial support. But generally, the font format we use seems to be not the worst one. Another one we could use is WOFF, this one. As you can see, the web open font format right here. And if you read the description right there, this is a compressed true type or open type font. And the first thing that's really good about that is, well, if it's a compressed format, it's smaller and therefore it makes our website faster, because we will later see when we talk about the font display property that fonts can become quite big. So the file size of font families can become quite big. This is maybe unexpected. And therefore, compression and loading times and maybe impacting these loading times is important when using our font faces right here, our customized font faces. As I said, more about that later at the end of this module. However, we can see that the WOFF format is compressed, which is great, and that the browser support is also quite awesome. So if we compare it with our first format, the TTF format, then we can say that TTF is really good because it's a really well-known and well-used format by font builders, actually, by font face builders. But the browser support is not perfect, as we saw with the IE. For the WOFF format, we have a better compression and a better browser support. In addition to the WOFF format, we also have WOFF 2 right here. As you can see, this provides an even better compression, but we can see that browser support for the IE is not there at all, and also Safari support is limited. So to summarize what we saw, we have the TTF format as a basic, which is widespread and well-known, but we have the problem with the IE. We then have WOFF, which has a better compression and is faster and has a better browser support in general. And then we have WOFF 2, which is the fastest one with the best compression, but with some limitations regarding browser compatibility. Therefore, what we could do now is we could simply add all three formats to our source for the font family. The problem is, of course, that we only have our custom font in this TTF format. And in this course, we also won't create the other files now. But in theory, if you have these files, what you could simply do is you could simply copy the URL right here, like that, maybe like this. Important, get rid of the semicolon right here and change it to a comma, also right here, and then add it a third time, now with a semicolon again. And then you could start with WOFF 2 right here. The format for WOFF 2 is also WOFF 2. Then we have WOFF as a second choice, this one and that one, not WOFF 2, WOFF only. And then TTF, our true type, as the third format that we have. As I said, in our case, we don't have all these formats, so we only need TTF, so we can delete these. But I just wanted to show you how this would work in general. And with these formats, you're actually quite safe when it comes to your custom fonts. There are also other formats, to be honest. But the reason I'm not diving deeper into these is, well, if I go back to 𝗓𝗢𝗢𝗏 and, for example, enter EOT, like that, the embedded open type font, well, you can see what I mean. We don't have any browser support at all. The only browser that supports it is the IE. And we saw that WOF is also perfectly supporting DIE, so I don't think it is required to dive deeper into the other formats that we have right here for our fonts. So with that, we understood these different font formats, and we can now dive deeper into different font properties that we can use for our fonts in the next lecture. So let's dive into some font properties now that we have, apply them, and see which impact they have onto our fonts. For that, I will now go to the customers page, maybe right here, so that we can see the font on a different page now. And let's have a look at this class right here. So the testimonial text class. Let's find this class also in our customers file right here. And let's now scroll down a bit right here. And let me now show you some of the font properties I just talked about. The first one is, of course, font size. I think I don't have to talk about the details regarding the units. We had an entire module about that. So we could, for example, say we use 40 pixels right here. And if I reload the page, you can see that the font size increases. I think that's pretty clear for you now. Another property that has a direct impact onto the way our text is displayed is this one, font variant. If I use this one, this small caps value, then the following will happen. If we reload the page, you can see that basically the height of our font did not change, but all our small characters that we had before were now changed to capital ones. So that's also just a property that basically impacts the style or the look of the font we have right here. Another property we have is font stretch, this one right here. There you can see that you can select different, stretch levels, so which define the way our font is displayed. And if I would now apply ultra condensed, for example, right here, and reload our page, you can see that the font looks exactly the same way it looked before. The problem with that font stretch property is that it is supported by browsers nowadays, so that's not the problem. But each stretching level has to be part of a separate font phase. And as this is not true for a lot of fonts, at least at the time when I'm recording this video, I will not dive deeper into this property. In case you want to find out more about it, just have a look at the MDN, for example, right here. Here you can also see what it would impact. And there you can find all the values you have. And as I said, what would happen if you have a font where it can be applied. But as I said, the browser support is good, as we can see it also down here. But the problem is that the font availability is not the best. Therefore, I will not dive deeper into font stretch right now. So these are the properties that basically affect the general style of the letters you have. But there are also other properties which have an impact onto the letter spacing, for example, and onto the line height. What that is, how they work, and what they do, let's find out that in the next lecture. So let's have a look at some other properties. For that, I will delete our font stretch and now add the letter spacing property, this one. For the letter spacing property, we have to use lengths as a value. So this can be either pixels or rem. I will use pixels now because I think it's easier to see like that. So let's say we use 5 pixels as letter spacing. If we do that and reload, we can see that the space between our letters, between each letter, increased. Or we could set it also to 10 pixels if you really want to have a big space between your letters. And as you can see, this is basically what letter spacing does. As the name already indicates, it increases the space between each of the letters that you have in your text right here. But we don't need that, so we can delete it right here. A more interesting property is the next one. This is white space. This one right here. For white space, we have no lengths, but we have properties like normal, like that. If we apply normal, well, as you can imagine, this will show us the text in its initial status. But with this white space, we can now impact the way white space is treated inside our element. And if we think about the white space we have right here for our testimonial text class right here, so this one, you host help me, right? Then we can see that we of course have white spaces in here. So this is a white space, this is a white space, and so on. So at the moment, if we go back to our customer CSS file, we have this white space normal. We see the behavior that we can observe right here. As soon as the element has enough space, the white space will jump up a bit and always start a new line where we have the white spaces and where it doesn't fit into the element. Now, if we change this from normal to no wrap, like that, then we can see, as the name already indicates, that no wrapping takes place. This means the entire text in our element will be displayed in one line, and the width of our window doesn't have any impact on that. As the name says, this is no wrap. If we change this to pre, like that, then we cannot see a difference right here. But if we go back to our code, to the index.html file, and now let's say we add a new paragraph, but not with the P, but just by hitting it like that on a keyboard, after project. Keep that in mind. If we now go back and reload the page, you can see that after project, we have this paragraph, and we see this indentation that we have right here. This is all automatically created by that value. We also have another one, which would be pre-wrap, this one right here. If we use this one and reload the page, then you can see that we have a line break right here, but that's simply due to the reason that the space is not enough right here. But as soon as we increase the size again, we can see that we have our project in one line. And after our project where we added this paragraph, we start in a new line, and then the next break, of course, is right here, because these words right here don't fit into one line. The last value we have is pre-line. Let's also have a look at what happens right then. If we use pre-line right here, like this, and reload the page, now you can see that the lines are filled whenever possible, because before we saw that this line right here was empty. But now we keep our line break right here, because we said that after project there should be a line break, so it has to put project into a separate line. But then we have the next one starting, and all the lines are filled whenever possible. So that's what you can do basically with white space. I think this is a nice property because it can help you really changing the way your text is displayed. However, we can now go back right here and put that new line back up again to avoid that white space. Yeah, I think it's better like that. So back to our customer's file now, to the CSS file, and back to another property, the line height property. Let's have a look at this one in the next lecture. So what is the line height property? Well, for that we will first delete the white space right here, because we understood how it works and we don't need it anymore. And then go to our packages page back again right here, and there to the package info class. So I'm again right here on this page and right here in these package infos. Specifically, I will focus onto this class right here because it only consists of one line, and this is what we need to understand the line height. Now let's add this line height property then. So line height, and let's start with a value of 1, and let's see what that means. So let's save that and reload the page. And if we now inspect it right here, we can see down there that we now have a line height of 18.8 pixels. Okay, let's keep in mind our font size, because the font size we actually have is this one, 19.2 pixels. You remember, 1.2 rem. And that's pretty close to that value actually. Now let's see if we can get closer. The first thing we should do is we should reduce our zoom level, because I again zoomed into the page to make sure you can see everything. But as we can see, have a look at the height right here of our content box, the height decreases. And now we are at 19 pixels already, which is pretty close to the 19.2 pixels. And the reason for that is that the line height calculation simply does not consider the decimals. Therefore, it will just stick to the 19, not the 19.2. But with that, you already saw what the line height actually is. The line height lets us define the top and the bottom, so the space between the top and the bottom, of our content box. And with that, we have 19 pixels now. And if we follow our calculation right here, if we change that to 2, then this should be 38. And if we scroll down again, then we can see it is indeed 38, because we take our actual font size, which is the 19.2 pixels, calculated based on the 1.2 rem, and 19.2 pixels times the 2 we added right here is 38.4, and then the decimals are not considered. Therefore, we have 38 pixels of line height right here. So this is one way how to define the line height. I will keep it zoomed out like that because it makes it easier to follow this pattern right now. This line height can of course also apply to other font families. Let's for example use our 𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗘𝗏 font that we used throughout this course. If I use this one and I reload, you can see that if we inspect it right here, that the line height is again 38 pixels. But there is one interesting thing. If I change the line height from 2 to normal, which is the default value, then you will see that right now we have a line height of 24 pixels for our 𝗧𝗜𝗢𝗏 font. But if I change it back to Anonymous Pro, so our custom font, this one right here, keep in mind we had 24 for 𝗧𝗏𝗏, then you can already see it actually. We only have 19 pixels of line height right now. So that's important to keep in mind. By default, the line height depends on the font family we are using. If we change that behavior and add the line height property with a value of 2, for example, then this will always refer to the font size. And as the font size, in our case at least, is the same for all font families, well, we have the same line height no matter which font family we are using. Now, of course, we are not only limited to using this number. We can also use pixels, like 32 pixels, for example, and if I now reload the page, as you can imagine, now we have a line height of 32 pixels. What's of course also possible is using percentages, for example. So if we use 200% like that, then we would simply apply a value of, if we scroll down again, you can see 38, so 200% of the initial font size. So that's basically how it works with percentages. However, I would always recommend not using percentages like here, but simply using the numbers like we did it before, because percentages sometimes lead to an unexpected behavior when it comes to inheritance, because sometimes the calculation basis for the percentage is not the font size of the element itself, but of an inherited font size of a parent. And then this can, as I said, lead to unexpected results. By using the number right here, we always make sure that the line height is calculated based on the actual font size of the element we apply this line height to. And that's probably the approach we can follow to ensure that our site exactly behaves the way it should behave. However, we don't need the line height actually right here, so we can simply get rid of that. And that's actually the basic concept of the line height. So you basically define the height of your content right here. Attached to this video, you can also find an article which will give you additional information about the line height property. So in case you want to dive deeper, feel free to have a look at this article. So with that, we understood the line height. Let's now have a look at text decoration and text shadow in the next lecture. So what can we do with text decoration and text shadow? Let's start with the decoration first. For that, I'm again right here in our package info class, and now I will add the text decoration property right here. for this element right here, we didn't apply any text decoration by default. But what we could do is, for example, we could apply a value of underline. If we do that and reload the page, we can see that, well, as expected probably, the text is underlined. If we have underline, we probably also have overline right here. If we change the value and have a look at the result, we can see that now we have, well, an overline for our text right here. So we have an underline, an overline. Well, we can probably also line through our text right here. Let's see if this also works. If I reload that, like that, yes. So that's what we can do. We can add an underline, an overline, or a line through. We can, of course, also more specify the line we want to have. We could add dotted right here, for example, to create a dotted line like this. As you can see, now we have this dotted line. This can, of course, also be applied to all the other values we had. For example, the underline again, so that we can see it better. And you could also choose a color of your choice, for example, red right here. If we do that and reload the page, we have a dotted underline with that red color. Another really nice line type is also this one here. So if we change dotted for wavy, if we do that and reload our page, you can see that we have this wavy line below our text right here. Looks kind of like an error, so maybe not the line type you always want to use, but I just wanted to show you this one. Of course, it's also available for overline and for line through, so this would be the overline style for this one, like that. And that's actually the main purpose of this text decoration property. We don't need it right here, of course, so we can, again, get rid of it. But one important thing you should also keep in mind when using text decoration is that if we go to our shared CSS file right here, and then go down to our anchor tag selector, so this one, there you could see that we used text decoration already. If I quickly comment that out now, like this and like that, and reload the page, then you can see that this default text decoration for links is back in again. So don't forget to use text decoration for both, to add such a decoration, of course, but also to remove a default decoration like we did it right here. Let's comment that in again, because we want to make sure that our text decoration for the links is not visible. Another property in connection with the text is the text shadow. So let's go back to our packages file right here and add such a shadow right now. So the property we need is text shadow, this one right here. And now we have to specify an offset to the x-axis, so 5 pixels maybe, and to the y-axis, also 5 pixels. So with that, let's see what this looks like if I reload the page. Yeah, this looks interesting, but probably not as we intended to look. I think we need two additional things. We need a blur radius, or a blur at least, to blur the actual text, because it should be a shadow and not a copy of the text. And then we need maybe a different color also. Let's see if we can add these two things. And to add the blur, we simply have to add a third value right here. And let's say we use a blur of maybe 2 pixels, something like that, and a color of gray, like this. Maybe we can also use a lighter gray, something like that. With that, if we go back and reload the page, we can see that our shadow looks a lot better. It's probably a bit too far to the right and to the bottom and still too sharp. So let's reduce the offset to the y-axis, to the x-axis, sorry, and to the y-axis, and increase the blur to maybe 7 pixels. Let's see what this looks like this. Yeah, I think now it looks quite cool, because now we have a really slight text shadow behind our text. And of course, we can play around with that a lot. We can also increase the blur more. We can, for example, add a color to the text shadow and make a blur of 20 pixels, something like that, just as you prefer. So as you can see, this would create this look. You could also set a offset of 0 if you want to, like this and like that, right? Would also not be a problem. If I reload, you can see that's what it would look like then. So feel free to play around with these values right here Again, for our project, I don't think we need the text shadow, so we unfortunately have to delete it once again, and with that bring back our initial cleaner look, as I would call it. And with that, we already saw all the core properties that are font related. Therefore, in the next video, I think it's time to show you the font shorthand, which kind of combines all these properties if you want to, but which also has one alternative functionality. So let's have a look at this shorthand in the next lecture. So how does the font shorthand work? Well, let's have a look at that at the example of our package info class right here once again. The font shorthand is simply added by writing the font property, this one right here. Now for the font shorthand, we can use different values. There are values which are optional and some values are a must. Additionally, the order of the values is important, so it needs to have the right order to work correctly. Now let's start with the two must values. The first must value is the font size, which would be 1.2 rem in our case. Right here. This means we can comment out this code for a moment, right here and right there. So that's the first must value, the font size. The second value we always have to add is our font family. Well, we have the font family right here, so we can simply add Anonymous Pro or Sans Serif right here to our code and comment it out right here. And note how I add it right here. We simply add value after value. If I do that and save now and reload the page, you can see there is no difference at all. So everything stayed the way it is. However, I told you that these are the values we need to have, but there are more optional values that we can include right here in our shorthand. One value we have right here, which we can include, is the font weight. So let me comment that out right here. And the font weight, and that's important, has to be positioned ahead of the font size. So you simply add 700 right here, for example. If we do that and reload the page again, you can see nothing changed. So this is how we can add the font weight right here. We also have other properties which we can add. This is, for example, the font variant. We talked about that. So if I add small caps right here, like we did it, and reload the page again, like that, then everything right here is displayed with these small caps. Also something we talked about. And again, have a look at the order. The important thing is that the font variant right here, this one, and the font weight are positioned ahead of the actual font size. That's really important to keep in mind. Another value we can position in front of the actual font size is the font style. The font style could be italic in our case, like that. If we now go back and reload the page again, you can see that we now have this italic style. Now, let me quickly add a comment down here to show you what you're doing right here. We have the font style right here. Then we had the font variant. Then we have the font weight right here. Then we have our font size. Then we have the font family. That's what we added so far. And the important thing really is that these three properties are positioned ahead of the font size, like that. That font family is the last value we specify, and that font size is directly coming, well, after these three values we have. It sounds really complicated, as you can see, but this is something you simply have to keep in mind or look up if you need it. You can find a link to the MDN attached to the article in this video, so this is a good resource to look that up and to keep that in mind. But if you look at these values or these properties we applied so far, you can see that one property is missing. And this is the line height. Line height is added directly after the font size, like that. And now it gets really confusing, right? Because, well, what should this mean? Well, this basically means that if we want to have a certain line height, then we simply add the slash and 2, for example. This simply means we added a line height of a number of 2. And if we now go back and reload the page, you can see that the line height increased, and we can inspect that, of course, right here inside our class, this one. And if we now go down, we can see a line height of 38.2. But if I again zoom out right here, then we have our well-known 38 line height that we learned in the line height lecture right here. Let me zoom in again, yet you can see everything. And that's actually the first purpose of this font shorthand. You can combine all these different properties and corresponding values like that. As I said, keep in mind to start with these 3 properties in case you have them. Then continue with the font size in combination with the line height, and then add the font family always as the last property or value right here in the shorthand. Another way to use this font shorthand is to refer to system fonts. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me first maybe delete everything we don't need right here. We don't need the line height, and we don't need italic and small caps, but the rest can be kept for our shorthand because we wrote it like that. So let's keep it in here like that. So we got our shorthand. Let's see if it's still working if I reload the page. Yeah, we have to close the curly braces. That would help here. So let's see if I now reload the page. Yeah, I think we got the look back from the beginning, but now we simply wrote our shorthand right here. With that, we can delete the font size right here, and also the font family and the font weight. I won't correct it for the entire code now because I want to keep both variants right here. But here you can see that with our font shorthand, we can also easily define what our font should look like. Let me actually add this part right here back again so that you have kind of a reminder of which properties in which order you should add to this shorthand. However, let me now also comment out our shorthand right here, like this and like that. So this basically leads to the following look now of our website. And let me now show you the second option with the font shorthand referring to system fonts. These system fonts or system font values simply refer to default font families which are applied to different parts of your operating system. This could be fonts which are used in menus, for message boxes, or for status bars, for example. Now, talking about menus, if I now add menu right here, like that, and reload the page, you can see that the font changed to a font that is used for menus on the Mac in my case right here. Another value would, for example, be a status bar, which we could add right here. And as you can see, the font size now decreases, for example, for such status bars. So that's the second option we have when using this font shorthand. It's either a shorthand, as I showed you previously, or you can also refer to such default system fonts. Now, to be honest, I don't think we need that right here, so we can get rid of it. What we can also do now is we can comment in our font right here once again, like this and like that, and reload the page right here. So we have our style that we defined, our custom style back in here. And with that, we also understood what the font shorthand is actually doing right here. And this brings me to the last core concept that I would like to show you as part of this module. I talked about that already when we talked about the file types of our font families or the font formats, that fonts can become quite big, and therefore performance is always a topic. So let's have a look at font performance and how we can impact the loading behavior of our fonts with the font display property. So what is the font display property and how does it impact the loading performance of our fonts? And that's important. By our fonts, I'm referring to our custom fonts that we imported by using add font face. Keep that in mind. Font display only works in connection with that. However, font display is a property, as you can imagine, and for this property, we can apply different values which impact the loading behavior of our custom fonts. The values we can have are swap, block, fallback, optional, or if we don't set anything, then it will be set to a value of auto by default. Auto simply means that the browser our visitor is using will automatically choose a value of his choice. So what do these values mean now? Well, let's have a look. We basically have two different, situations while the loading process of the font takes place. This is the so-called block period, this one right here, and the swap period, that one. Now, what do these mean and how are they different for the different values that we can apply? For the swap value, we don't have any kind of block period. Now, what does this mean, block period, and why don't we have a block period right here for this swap value? Well, to understand the block period, imagine the following situation. Our user is visiting our website, so the content has to load. Now, as the fonts are not displayed immediately, we could have such a block period. In this block period, the space where our text would be displayed would be reserved with an invisible fallback font face, and that's important. The font face would not be visible at the moment, but the space for it would be reserved. This would be a block period. So we basically would have the styling or the general structure of our website visible. So a box which would contain text already has almost the correct height and is visible, but no text would be displayed because the font is an invisible fallback. That would be a block period. Now, if we don't have such a block period, which is the case for the swap, the fallback right here would be immediately visible. This means once our users browses our website, boom, the fallback will be there. After that, we have a swap period. And the swap period, as the name already indicates, simply is the period where the browser has the ability to change or to swap the fallback font style that was loaded with the actual font style that we have. For the swap value, this period is infinite. This simply means no matter how long it takes, if our browser manages to load our custom font that we want to display, it will swap it with the fallback. If it cannot change it, the fallback will just stay there. So that's the first value, that's swap. Now what about block now? Well, for block, we have a short block period. This means this invisible font is loaded, so there is no text displayed, but we have a placeholder right there, reserving the space. And after that, the behavior actually follows the swap value. We load the fallback, and once you can load it, the browser will change the fallback with the custom font that we created. The third value is the fallback. The fallback has a very short block period, so we have this invisible font family displayed, but only for a really minimum amount of time. Then we have the fallback, and then, now it gets interesting, we only have a short swap period. So there is only a short window of time where the browser has the chance to load our custom font right here and to change it with our fallback. If the browser is able to do that within this swap period, this short swap period, he can change it with the custom font. Otherwise, the fallback will be displayed as long as our site is displayed for the visitor. So that's the difference. For the fallback, there is only a short opportunity to change the fallback with the custom font. For swap and block, the loading of the custom font or the attempt to load the custom font lasts forever, basically, as long as the user is on our website. Now, optional is the last value that we have. For optional, we also have a very short block period. And then this thing right here. Then we don't have a swap period because the optional value simply allows the browser to choose, well, what he should do. And this basically depends on the internet connection speed. If the browser decides that our connection is good, he might decide to immediately load the custom font. If we have a worse connection which is not fast enough, the browser might decide to use the fallback and therefore not load our custom font. This decision cannot be reversed, of course. If we reload the page, it can, but as soon as we stay on the website as a user, we will only see the fallback, for example, if the internet connection is not good enough. Now the last value, auto, lets the browser make the entire decision. At the moment, the most browsers choose block then. So if you don't set a font display, auto will be applied, and then it will use block, the one we saw right here, as a second option. Now, the problem with this font display and this performance topic is that the fonts we are using right here load really fast. So, to be honest, I cannot show you this in a real life example now. What I can show you though, if we go back to our code right here, is how you could add or implement the font display property. Well, important, not right here in our actual selector, so in the actual element, but we have to add it up here in our font face import. For example, if we use our first import here, we would simply add font display like that. As I said, I cannot show you how it works because the loading time is simply too fast, but basically you would simply add the property up here and then simply apply the values like swap or block or fallback, or the last one, we also saw this, optional. Oops, like that. That's how you could do it. However, as I said, well, I cannot show it to you, so we can delete that actually once again. What we should have a look at now, though, is the browser compatibility, because as you might imagine, it's not the best, unfortunately. If we go to caniuse.com once again and enter font minus display right here, you can see what I mean. We have support for the latest versions of Safari, Chrome, and Firefox, but for example, the IE or Edge don't support the font display property at all. And that also kind of summarizes the difficulties you could have when you use your own created fonts with add font face, with the font import. The import itself can mean a lot of work, as we have to import all the different font faces. And then if we want to optimize our loading behavior, we also have to ensure that browser compatibility is okay for the users we want to address. And as you normally also want to address IE or Edge users, well, this can become a problem. However, of course, you're totally free to do this as you prefer. Now, with that, we are almost done with this module. There is actually only one thing that I would like to change right here, and this is our font shorthand, because we actually don't need the Anonymous Pro font family here, because I would like to stick to Montserrat as we had it in the beginning, and I also don't want to have this bold style. And additionally, now very important, as we only have one value left right here, the font size, we cannot use the font shorthand. We talked about that. We at least need the font size and the font family. Otherwise, this shorthand won't work. I can also prove this to you if I now go back to our page right here, to the packages page, and then inspect, for example, the class right here. You can see that the font was not applied because we used the shorthand incorrectly. Now, if I add font size right here, like that, and reload the page, you can see that the font size was overtaken correctly based on the definition that we made. And with that, I think our code is cleaned. So we learned a lot, I think, about fonts and text now. And before I wrap up this module, let's quickly have a look if all pages still look fine. As we can see right here, this looks pretty decent. So the font style is correct and the font families. The packages page also looks nice. Same thing hopefully for the customers page. Yeah, I think also still good. And start hosting also works perfectly. Now with that, we finished this text and fonts module. Now let me wrap up what we learned in the next lecture. So now that we are real text and font experts, let me quickly summarize what we have to keep in mind. The first thing we have to keep in mind is that we have generic and font families. A generic family is actually a fallback in case a font family is not available. And a font family allows us to define the exact font that we want to use. We saw that at the beginning of this module when we had a look at the syntax, for example, where we had the font family first and then the generic family as a fallback, where the specific font family will then be chosen by the settings in the browser. We also had a look at the way how to import font families onto our website or into our code. The important thing is that we need to make sure that we have the font families that we use for our website in the code also available for our website users. If we rely on locally installed font families, which could be installed on our computer, but maybe not on the machine of our website user, this can cause problems. We can avoid these problems by using embedded font families with @fontface. We talked a lot about that. Also about the disadvantages this approach might come with. Or we can import font families from third-party providers like Google with Google Fonts. This is the approach we will follow throughout this course. Another thing we had a look at are the font properties. I will not dive into each property again, but we saw all of that. We saw the font size, the font style, which allowed us to create an italic style, for example. We had a look at the weight and about the importance of adding different font faces for our weight. We saw font stretch, which is very well supported by browsers, but not that perfect from a font family availability perspective. And we saw font variant, which allowed us to add this small character style to our website. We also saw letter spacing, white space, and the line height, which allowed us to define the height of our content box basically. And we worked with text decoration and text shadow to add underlines or overlines to our text, or to also add some nice shadow behind it. Then we had a look at font display. This defines the loading behavior of our customly created fonts with @fontface. And we saw that we have different values available, which can be distinguished by their block period and their so-called swap period. The default value is auto, which simply means that the browser will choose a value, of his choice, which is usually block. And to summarize kind of what we learned, the font shorthand takes into account a lot of the properties we talked about, but it can not only be used as a shorthand, it also allows us to refer to system font families, so font families applied for different parts on our operating system, for example for message boxes, and therefore also has these two purposes, which we had a look at. And with that, we actually finished all the core concepts of CSS with this module. Because in the next module, it's time to dive into a more advanced concept. We will have a look at Flexbox. So we will see how we can use this tool or this concept to change the way our elements behave really easily. So really looking forward to this module. Let's have a look at Flexbox then as a next step in this course.